Well, for the first lab of the semester, we are going to be running a Grignard reaction between methyl magnesium bromide, phenyl magnesium bromide, which we'll make from bromobenzene and magnesium with the aid of an iodine crystal. And the purpose of the iodine crystal is just to react with the surface of the magnesium to give some free magnesium surface, because magnesium reacts with oxygen very readily to form magnesium oxide. And then we're going to react that with 2-methyl cyclohexanone to do an addition to make the tertiary alcohol from that ketone. And we're going to do that in anhydrous ether. So I've got a nice fresh can, unopened, of anhydrous ether. Water is the enemy in the organometallic reactions because they're such strong bases that they readily react with the proton of water to just form, in this case, benzene, and then the reaction can't occur. So the first step is going to be to take all the glassware that I put in the oven last week and cool it in this desiccator. And I'm going to use a giant desiccator from my research lab instead of the small desiccator so that everything will fit in at once. See, it's always easiest to take the desiccator to the oven rather than taking the hot glassware across the lab to the desiccator. As always, when you're taking the lid off the desiccator, you want to grip it pretty firmly and just slide that off of there. And we'll set that down. And then put some gloves on to get the glassware out. You'll see there's a bunch of syringes in there from the research lab. So what's in here is a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder and a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder. We're going to be using to measure out the ether and the cyclohexanone, the separatory funnel that we're going to be using to actually do the addition, and then a couple of thermometer adapters without the rubber part, the round bottom flask with the stir bar in it, and the Claisen adapter, and a condenser. Somebody's stolen the good gloves. These gloves are a challenge. And then I also put the magnesium in the oven to dry so that we would have nice clean magnesium. So we'll stick the lid back on that. And because the glassware is hot, it's probably going to build up a little pressure, so I'll break that with this cork. And we'll carry that back over to our bench. Make sure that's sealed tight. And we're just going to wait for that to cool so that it doesn't condense any moisture from the atmosphere onto the glassware as it cools. So while that's cooling, we can go and grab a metal bath and a stirring hot plate. Even though we only have to heat to 35 degrees because ether boils at 35 degrees, we're going to use a sand bath instead of a water bath, because if we use a water bath, it's likely that we'll get some condensation up into the reaction. We don't want that. So we're going to use a minimal amount of sand because the stir bar has to stir through it. And there should be sand over here. So I want to fill this about a third full. And that way when I sink the round bottom flask, I'll be able to sink it almost all the way down into the bottom of the sand. We're going to need some hoses for our condenser. I'll grab a couple of these amber hoses. And we're going to want to clamp both the round bottom flask and the Claisen adapter. That'll be for the separatory funnel later when we do the extraction. So I'm going to be setting it up so that I'm using this clamp on the neck of the round bottom flask. And so that I can get that at about the right height, I'm going to take a different round bottom flask and just clamp that in there for now. And what I want to do is kind of jiggle that down so I can get it as close to the bottom of the sand bath as possible. So that should be about the right height for that guy. And then we're going to be putting a Claisen adapter on. And since the one is hot, I'm going to use another one. They may be slightly different. And the condenser will go in the back and the separatory funnel in the front so that I can easily manipulate it. And I'm going to use one of these adjustable clamps to clamp the top joint of the Claisen adapter. That way, by removing the stir plate, I'll be able to take the flask off and leave the remaining material in place if necessary. Always tighten the clamp to the ring stand first. Then once you have the distance adjusted, clamp that down tight because it moves it a little bit. And actually it's moving it a lot, so I'm going to have to move this up a bit. And then the last thing you want to clamp is the joint. And there's no reason for me to clamp this tightly since this isn't the actual Claisen adapter I'll be using anyway. So that should at least be approximately adjusted to the right place. Put these guys back. And I'm going to need a stopcock. It would be nice if I had one that matched. And then the two thermometer adapters will require these little rubber things to go on top, and some drying tubes, which hopefully are in the desiccator. So these should actually have been reassembled. This one's missing an O-ring anyway. So that's an assembly that looks like it matches. I'll use that for the set funnel. This one doesn't have all its pieces, so we'll put that one away in the spare parts drawer. So now we just have to wait for that to cool. In order to get some nice, clean, fresh magnesium surface, I'm going to take the magnesium turnings, and before I add them to the ether, I'm going to break them up with a mortar and pestle to try to generate a little bit of flat surface. So I'll grab this mortar and pestle here. So I'll just quickly bash on them to generate a little broken surface before I put them in with the ether. So this kind of finishes the assembly. We're waiting for stuff to cool, and I can't really measure anything out, but I can uncap my ether. And it looks like, yeah, that's been used. And we're using 2 milliliters of bromobenzene, so I will be using a nice clean 1 ml syringe and needle. And since these have been unopened, I'll know they're dry. Make sure that I don't get any water. And I'll be needing the 2 drying tubes that are in here. And those should still be dry because there's still a little bit of blue in the desiccant, which means it's not completely saturated with water yet. I will need a little bit of water though, because in order to get the condenser hoses onto the condenser, it's always a good idea to wet those first. So I will get a beaker ready, but I want to make sure that water doesn't get into the reaction. So we'll sit that in there for now. So that's our assembly. Let's actually undo this and make sure that the drying agent in there is free flowing. Yeah, it looks good. I think both of those drying tubes are still good. So once I start putting the reaction assembly together, I'll also hold it together with some Keck clips. And this hood seems not to have any Keck clips. So we'll see if there are some in the spare parts. So there are 3 up here. So I'll be using a Keck clip on top of the condenser to attach the thermometer adapter with the drying tube, and on top of the SEP funnel, and I'll also connect the separatory funnel to the Claisen adapter with a Keck clip. And then I'd like one more Keck clip, which I'm going to steal off the rotovap, maybe 2, so I can connect the condenser as well, and that'll keep any of those joints from coming apart. This is probably the most complicated reaction that's run in the 2-semester sequence of organic chemistry. So we'll see that once we're starting to cool. It's still a little warm. So I'm going to stop the camera and I'll wait for that to cool properly.